I'll go down the table here. We're really very fortunate. Some of you may have been here in the morning and heard some of our panelists speak, and they all did a tremendous job at talking about the census from very different perspectives and points. And so I'm really excited to have them here now for this hour. On my far right, Nancy Potok, Deputy Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, Economics and Statistics Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Flavia Jimenez, Director of the New Americans Initiative at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Robert, is it Gurga? Research Fellow at Chapin Hall here at the University of Chicago. And Alan Berube, Senior Fellow and Research Director at the Metropolitan Policy Program of the Brookings Institution. So, Alan, I'm going to start with you. You did a great job this morning putting up a lot of data and really talking about something reporters love. And you never use the word, but you pointed to a lot of trends in population shifts. And if I were a reporter, I would have come away with about 12 story ideas from that presentation. But I'm going to ask you, you talked about the suburbanization of poverty and the elderly and lots of things, but if you were to choose sort of the handful of, you think, most urgent trends or stories that you see on the horizon for the census, how would you guide these reporters?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for being here, everybody. Thank you, Anne-Marie. So I'm a researcher from Washington, D.C. I focus on sort of national trends in demographic data and the census, but I have a specific interest, obsession in sort of cities and suburbs and the changing character of metropolitan communities. So when I thought about the possibilities coming out of 2010, there's a bit of a difference between what I talked about this morning and what I would talk about here, and that I was this morning's presentation using the American Community Survey, which is everything, right? It's the topics that you'll get out of 2010, plus it's education and income and commuting and a whole host of things about the social and economic character of America. That's not what the 2010 census is going to be. It's going to be the more, as you all know, the more basic things like population, race and ethnicity, relationships, et cetera. So, but there were some things I talked about this morning that I think will be revealed or re-revealed through the 2010 census. So let me just point to, maybe three of those. First is something I recall from the 2000 census, but it's likely to happen again to some extent this time around. I'm not sure to what extent, but is the possible existence of population surprises in cities versus what the Census Bureau is putting out through its population estimates versus what we're actually going to get when we do a full and accurate count of population in cities. So I need to use this. Is it actually working? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. There were a lot of older cities that, in the lead up to the 2000 census, put a great deal of legwork into getting full and complete address lists. Finding those hard to count corners of the city that Nancy referred to in her presentation this morning, and it turned out that there were quite a few more people living in. There were, I think, as many as 1 million more people living in New York City than we thought there were in 1999. Actually, living there in 2000 when we did the full count. Similar surprises in D.C. and Chicago and a lot of older cities where you've got changes going on between censuses that make the estimate methodology not all that reliable because it's based on what you learned from the last census on vacancy rates or household sizes. So there's something about the character of urban America and the influence of immigration in cities that could contribute to more population surprises in cities this time around as well. And the better cities do at finding those addresses, the better this update enumerate process goes in the lead up. I think that the greater those surprises could be. A second trend that I noted this morning that is spotty but real is what some refer to as this sort of demographic inversion in metropolitan areas. Is these twin trends of white population coming back to cities in greater numbers, and I haven't looked at the Chicago numbers in detail, but if it's anything like New York, Boston, Washington, Atlanta, whites are either gaining in number here or are shrinking in number much much less fast than they were during the 1990s. Whites gaining slightly in Chicago. So there you go. I think white population was down significantly in Chicago in the 1990s. So getting a little bit beneath that trend, I think, to investigate at the neighborhood level, what is gentrification, right? I mean, I think it's important to learn whether white population actually seems to be replacing or displacing minority population at the community level in parts of Chicago, or whether these are neighborhoods that are just repopulating and there's new infill housing going in and whites are being added to the community, but minority population is stable or perhaps rising. People who do research on gentrification actually find that there's some evidence that minority individuals who live in communities that are repopularizing in this way are in some instances more likely to stay when newcomers come into those neighborhoods because they perceive that the quality of the neighborhood is improving as well. So I think getting behind those trends at a neighborhood level could be really important. And then finally, I think and I referred to this in my remarks today about the aging of suburbs and the issues around access to services, access to transportation, access to retail for the more vulnerable older households that we're seeing more and more of in suburban communities today. I guess NORC around here means something, but for demographers, NORC means naturally occurring retirement community, which is what's going on in some city neighborhoods, but in more and more suburbs, as well as the World War II generation and eventually the boomer generation, which were really suburban generations to their core, remain there as they gray. And I think when you look at the data, I think trying to differentiate between the less vulnerable senior population, the 65 to 74-year-old crowd, those that are parts of married couples, versus what one might think of as the more vulnerable crowd, 75 and above, single-person households. What types of communities are they living in, and then what kind of challenges arise from the design of those communities in terms of making sure that they have a decent quality of life in suburbia. So just a few thoughts off the top of my head.
My work is primarily in Chicago and with children and families, and as most of you know, there's been a dramatic change in the demography in Chicago, and that's an opportunity with the census, and perhaps more importantly, again with the American Community Survey, the ACS, over the next 6 months, and then when the census data starts coming out, to look at how neighborhoods in Chicago have changed with respect to families with children. We know about the Latino movement to the northwest, southwest, and southeast sides of the city, and this general movement of children with families away from the lake, and the movement of, as Alan was saying, from on the south side down with CHA transformation, families moving south, and then those families moving to further south, and then they displacing families into the suburbs. So this issue of suburban disadvantage, greater suburban disadvantage in Chicago, it'll be interesting to see how that works over time. And the ACS will be able to do some of that work as families, as poorer families and families with children, which are usually sometimes the same thing, move into the suburbs. Looking at the concentration of disadvantage, I think in Chicago will be interesting, as I think it's spread out. In some of the communities which are traditionally more middle income, northwest side, southwest side, are going to look a little poorer, especially since we're taking the census in a recession. How is that going to affect what the numbers look like in Chicago? There's a lot of talk in the federal government, and we didn't talk about it today at all, but a lot of other studies that the federal government is doing are saying, should we do this study right now in the middle of the recession? Many of them say yes, because when we do the next one, it'll look better. So that's a big issue, is kind of the timing of this census and what it'll look like relative to the recession. The other issue is I combine data. I combine census data with service data. And as we learn more about from the census about who's living where and what kind of families are living where, I would encourage you to look at if there are services where there are more families. As I said this morning, it's harder to catch up, be it the schools, be it childcare, be it after-school programs, and other resources in these communities. As these communities grow, the services usually stay for a while in the communities that have shrunk. So there's this mismatch of need. Some families go back to their old communities and use the services there, and slowly but surely they get more acclimated to their new community and find service providers, be it childcare or doctors or dentists or whatever it may be. And then, so over a few years, we see a potential continue to see a lack of services, but it may have more effect as they become more acclimated to new communities. So looking at multiple, and a lot of this is available now. City of Chicago has a number of websites where you can look to see the availability of services across the city, and combining that with census data, I think will be an interesting story once we have the decennial census and great, really good census tract data in terms of even the limited amount of information that's going to be on the short form.
Flavia, you're right now on the front end of this process. You talked a lot in your comments earlier today about just getting to the point where people are willing to give the information that helps people, create this huge data bank. So I was hoping maybe you could share with the reporters who maybe didn't hear that work and where you would direct them or point them to things that might not be obvious.
Yeah. So for those of you that didn't hear the presentation this morning, I'll just give you the Cliff Notes. But essentially, what we're trying to do is go very much in depth into communities that had particularly low counts in the last census. So areas specifically that had 50% or less return rates. And we're doing this in a coordinated campaign with organizations that are trusted in the communities, that have lots of established ties into the communities, and that community members can actually recognize right away. So it's a door-knocking operation that we have almost hit our target of 66,000 households. We're at 65,000 door knocks, and we will be visiting our universe again, and then we will be calling our universe after that, and then they will also be getting a piece of literature to remind them about this. And so, we're facing some challenges, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, with the undocumented population in the immigrant communities. But if I could just mention, the lunchtime talk really did resonate with me tremendously, because when I was at National Council of La Raza, we worked a lot on state initiatives that were anti-immigrant municipal state ordinances specifically. And Carpentersville, I think, is a lesson learned. I think it'll be really interesting to see, as Ellen mentioned, some of the shifts in population. So what is happening with whites that once moved to the suburbs are primarily Latinos, although other immigrants as well. This is true for the Arab population in Illinois as well, continuing to move out to the suburbs. And do counties that saw few percentage of Latinos living there, are they growing as well? I think that the answer will be yes, and that counties like Will County, for example, what is the infrastructure there to meet those needs? Is there appropriate bilingual staff, particularly in state agencies, to meet the needs of the growing population? So, it's a challenge because, again, the resources were rather limited. We would like to have been able to extend much more outside of Chicago, because we know that there's such a growing need. We are in Cicero, Berwyn, Waukegan, and Aurora right now, specifically with this Census Fellow program. But we know that places like, Joliet and, have have seen tremendous increases in the past 10 years. So, we're just going to continue. Some of you that I know, particularly reporters that I've talked to in the past month or so, continue to have this relationship of getting information to the ethnic press, because we know that that's really one of the best ways that we can get the message out to our communities about the confidentiality and the importance of the census.
So leave it down here. Nancy, one of the things that you mentioned to me when we were talking is your concern about the extent to which census coverage is really dominated by a single source in this country, that there's an AP reporter who covers the census, and largely what Americans are hearing or learning about that is coming from a single, very narrow funnel. So that was one thing I know you wanted to talk about, and maybe some others.
Mm-hmm. So first off, I have to confess, I'm a media junkie. I read very comprehensive news clips twice a day. I get morning clips and afternoon clips. And I also have to confess, I've read some of your articles. I read your article on the Ford bill and prisoners, which I thought was quite good, really covered the issue. And then there was another one from Northwest Indiana about a small community there of 25,000 people and their worries about falling under the 25,000 range, and some other stories like that. So reading clips comprehensively from all over the country twice a day, I see a lot of census stories. And I guess I would put them into three categories. One is what you just mentioned, which is almost a verbatim repeat of what one wire reporter decided was the story. And then it's multiplied hundreds and hundreds of times across the country in the local press, and understandably, because the budget isn't there for every paper in the country to have their own Washington bureau, so they pick it up off the wire. What concerns me about that is that there isn't most of the outlets that are picking up those stories don't go back and fact check at all. They just pick up the story, and I read the clips, but I also know the facts, and so I find that a little hard to deal with sometimes. And that's what I was saying, is when you see that one person can really sort of control the story across the whole country just because of the way the media is set up now, where so many outlets do just pick up the wire story. So as reporters, for those of you who are reporters in the room, I would encourage you, if you're inclined to do that, to at least put your own spin on it, to maybe pick up the phone and do a little fact check and call up the Census Bureau if it's a wire story about the census, and don't just take it verbatim. I'm not saying it's not a story. I'm just saying, you can build on that. You can put your own spin on it. It's not that hard. People at the Census Bureau are really geared to take those kind of calls and respond. So that would be one category of story. The second category of story that I see a lot of, and I think they're important stories, so I would encourage you to sort of include them in your repertoire. Those are the stories really about census operations that are taking place. So, for example, when the questionnaire assistance centers open up, those are interesting stories to go there from the local standpoint and go talk to the people who are staffing those questionnaire assistance centers. Talk about them. It sort of serves a dual purpose. It really increases awareness of them, and it provides some insight into the thinking of the people who are both staffing them. Why did they think it was important? Why is it important for that neighborhood to have a questionnaire assistance center there? And for those of you who aren't sure what a questionnaire assistance center is, it's a center where people can walk in and get help. Generally, if they have a problem with either literacy in English or they don't speak English, so you can get help in multiple languages there. And each neighborhood, I think, has sort of a different flavor in terms of who's in those questionnaire assistance centers and what they're interested in. So if you can follow the census operations and sort of put that local spin on it, I think, if you are writing either with a neighborhood in mind in a city like Chicago or small communities, those are really good human interest stories that you can get in there. And the operations are progressing now. So these centers will open up, telephone assistance centers will open up. People will start getting questionnaires in the mail. In some areas, they'll be getting bilingual questionnaires for the first time. So it might be interesting just to get reactions from people. What did you think? You got your form in English and Spanish this time. Or going into some of the more linguistically isolated areas that you think may include your readership areas, and asking them, did you know that you can get a form that to help you fill out the form in English that's in Somali or that's in 59 different languages? Would you use the website? Just sort of including the neighborhood in these stories as these operations unfold. So that would be a second type of story. So you've got the national angle that sort of covers, there was a congressional hearing on the census type of angle, and putting your own spin on that. Then you've got these operational stories as the operations unfold, and you're drawing in the community that you're writing about. And then the third one really goes to some of these demographic stories. So they're more based on the data and the uses of the data. And that goes to, why is it important, if my town has 25,001 people versus 24,000 people? Why does that make a difference? And that goes, again, to sort of looking into, well, what are the results of the census? How is it used in this area? It was an interesting discussion this morning, and I think it was your panel, talking about, this, how do you reach some of the hard to count populations that either they don't sort of have a connection in their head. What is the connection between me and the census? What's in it for me to fill out this form? And so making that connection for them can be an interesting story. And that, there's sort of the, if you don't have a lot of time, there's a more, I hate to use the word superficial, but there's sort of the story where you don't have to do a lot of digging if you're not an investigative reporter, but you just want to write a story. There's a lot of information out there about, and a lot of it's available from the Census Bureau in terms of how money is used, how it's allocated, what does it mean to this community. And if you talk to people on the complete count committees, if you talk to mayors or people on their staff, you can get a lot of that. But then the other rolls into what I would call the more in-depth story. If you have more time, you can put more effort into it. And that gets into some of these issues. They're political issues that come out of census data that don't relate directly to the Census Bureau per se, but this is sort of the story of how are prisoners counted and what does that mean to the state? What does it mean to communities in the state? What are the tensions that get set up between the haves and the have-nots? And those are really interesting stories, and I think there's a lot of those. So I would just say, you can sort of categorize these if you have a lot of time or a little time, and really cover this pretty extensively from a lot of different angles.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to turn it over to the journalists. One is that a lot of the discussion around the fault lines in the U.S. Census tends to focus on Americans not filling out their forms, not caring. The focus is on the subscriber end of it, really. And I'm wondering how journalists can think about making sure the Bureau is doing its job too, and that the actual employees of this service are doing what the nation needs them to do. And I'm thinking there was a story out of New York recently about whole buildings and areas, because the city has changed so much in the last 10 years. Corners of the city that weren't developed at all. There are now high-rises there that didn't exist. And so literally Americans not even getting a mailing because that address was non-existent 10 years ago. And so thousands of people left not even contacted, let alone have the opportunity to decide not to fill out their census form. In a city like Chicago, where there has been so much new development in the past decade, neighborhoods, we were talking this morning a little bit about North Kenwood, Oakland, a neighborhood that really was quite under the radar 10 years ago, is now much bigger, much more populated than it ever was, and includes buildings that just didn't exist. That's one example, and I'm wondering how concerned you all are about that. But other ways that you can think of that journalists can be focused on that piece of the story as well. Any of you?
Yeah, you want to try, Nancy?
So the Census Bureau is actually very concerned about that. New construction, or if it's not new construction, building conversions have been very common. New construction, of course, was really going pretty healthily earlier in the decade. It's slowed a lot now, but the Census Bureau knows that the cornerstone of an accurate census is having an accurate list of all the housing units and where they're located. So puts huge amounts of time, effort, money into trying to have a complete address list. And there's a couple of different programs that the Census Bureau is in the process of carrying out, some underway right now as we speak, in working with local communities. And I think there are some interesting stories there. Because there is a tension between the Census Bureau and the local communities in disputing whether these addresses really exist or not, with the community saying, the Census Bureau, how dense can they be? The stuff is right here, I can look at it. And the Census Bureau saying, well, either we already have it on the list, but the way that we've coded this is slightly different than what you've done, so it looks different. You think it's not there, but we know it's really there. Or in fact, they've missed it. Which happens. There's no doubt about it. The address list is never 100% complete. And maybe it is because of new construction, or maybe it's because when someone went out and looked at the building, they said this is a warehouse and weren't aware that there were brand new lofts inside with, so there were 10 big units in the building. So I have read stories about it, I think some from Chicago, because a lot of the big city mayors are quite upset about what they think are gaps in that address list, and they think that communities will not get forms mailed to them. There were two programs. One was called the Local Update of Census Addresses, otherwise known as LUCA, L-U-C-A, where local communities were able to look at addresses that the census gave them and comment on it and say whether they thought they were complete. They sent in their own addresses that they thought were missing. The Census Bureau either accepted them or rejected them, and now they're appealing them to a special appeals board. So that's kind of an interesting story to find out, did your community participate? How many addresses did the Census Bureau reject, and how many are being appealed, and what you think is going to happen with those, and where they're located, and who's in and who's out. That is an interesting story. The other is that local communities were invited to participate in a program that identifies new construction. It's actually called new construction, specifically to get the new construction addresses into the list. They did send a lot of addresses earlier. The Census Bureau tries to update through the decade. Unfortunately, a lot of those places are just a couple of foundations in the ground where some developer envisioned a massive subdivision would be by now, and the economy has just ground that to a halt. So for the Census Bureau spends a lot of time sorting through which construction actually occurred and what going back some months, what might actually be there at the time of the mailing with the mailbox. But they've also, and I would suggest if you do uncover a lot of people in your community saying, I think there's discrepancies, we're missing a lot, go to the Census Bureau, call the folks at the Census Bureau. They like to be called. They have a public information office, and say, well, what are you doing to put these on the address list? Because they do have a lot of operations where they're planning to include these addresses that are being appealed. But I agree, it's a great story. It's really worth looking into your own community and seeing what the community leaders are saying versus what the Census Bureau is saying and what the solutions are.
I have a comment on that. Yeah. I think we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I think one of the things that has changed tremendously over the past years is we have a lot of young people who we've trained through this program who are using Google Maps in a really extraordinary way. And I was at a forum the other day talking specifically about redistricting, and the Mexican American Legal Defense Education Fund was there and told stories about how 20 years ago, they would have legal interns during the redistricting, literally with huge maps and magic markers, right? Like trying to draw the districts that at that point MALDEF imagined would be the best possible redistricting according to the Voting Rights Act. And now it's changed. And, I invite you to check out any of the neighborhoods where we're working. It's up on our website, icirr.org, under the New Americans Initiative. And you can see there a list of organizations that are working in the Census Project. Just to give an example, the Resurrection Project is in the Pilsen area. And you saw earlier, if you were at the presentation, how much of those red areas, so those hard to count areas, are not even places where people live anymore. So going to your question, so either development, has completely changed that and people no longer live there, or really it's been the population has shifted. But through, these maps, now our fellows are able to see, really, using technology, what is it really like? Like, what is the map like in this area? And so where can I go door knocking, and where does it not even make sense for me to go? And also there's a lot of, obviously, know-how of there's a lot of information of the community because, these folks live there. But, I invite any of you who want to get a little bit more deeply into getting to know what folks are finding when they're actually trying to talk to people, to contact me. I have some cards, and if you're interested in a particular neighborhood, we can definitely put you in touch with that person and find out more about that.
Let me mention one other thing before we go on. Since we got on the topic of maps, I assume that most of you did your homework and have been to the Census Bureau website and explored it. But I do want to point out that there's a new feature coming that I think you'll find of great interest, which is the tract by tract updated everyday response rates. So when the questionnaires get mailed out, which will be around March 15th, starting shortly after that, towards the end of March, you'll be able to go to the website and pull up any census tract and see each day what the mailback rate was for those questionnaires. And you'll be able to pull up side by side other tracks. So if you want to compare two neighborhoods, and you can say, oh, wow, this neighborhood, they're already at 50% 2 weeks after the forms got mailed out, and this one's at 10%. So there's definitely a story there. Why is one at 10% and one's at 50%, and what are people doing about it in the community and from the Census Bureau?
These organizations import that to their own websites and have, if they've got a map of the city of Chicago by neighborhood or something, have those.
I don't think
you can link to it at least.
Yeah, you definitely will be able to link to it. So if you wanted like a city website that said check out our response rate every day, you could put a link that would go directly to the website of the Census Bureau.
Okay. I wanted, before we lose Alan, I wanted to ask you, you talked a lot this morning about the increasing metropolitan nature of the nation. And so I was wondering when I was listening to you, so where are they coming from? And if we got in a car and started driving downstate right now, would we just find these sort of gone fishing signs on, various communities? Or is it just that we're expanding the border of what we define as a metropolitan region? But who are these folks and where are they coming from?
My presentation referred to the increasing share of the nation's population that's in big metropolitan areas, and of course the Chicago metropolis is growing. It, as you referred to, it grows because it it redefines itself because it continues to sort of sprawl in all directions. And as it does, there are more and more people who live out there but commute back into here. And then the Census Bureau and the Office of Management and Budget get together and they say, okay, the region used to have 6 counties, now it has 9 counties. After the 2010 census, they'll look at it again and they'll say, oh, now it has 12 counties, now it has 15 counties, and it goes all the way up to Green Bay or what have you. But I think it's also the case that the big areas like the Chicago region are magnets for the smaller environs that surround it. I think throughout the Midwest, I think this city, this region is a big and vibrant labor market that draws in, especially people who are in their kind of peak migration years, the sort of post-college, the 25 to 44-year-old crowd that sees opportunity in a big region, sees a dense labor market with a lot of different opportunities that are going to suit them at different points in their career. They're coming here not to just have one job for the rest of their lives, but they're coming to Chicago because they can have multiple types of jobs that they wouldn't be able to get if they spent the rest of their days in Green Bay. So, I think that's the sort of story that will follow on the count and learning how many people live in this region, but then sort of closer follow-up work with communities that grew a lot, that have more young people, finding out where folks came from and why. I think there's a lot of possibilities in that kind of reporting.
Okay, I want to open it up to you all now. You make let people who are reporters actually ask questions. I'm going to encourage people who are actually reporters to ask questions. So yes.
I think we have a lot in the room.
We're going to record it, so why don't you just raise your hand if you have a question, and then we'll give you the mic for this recording. And just introduce yourself again and your publication.
Wendell Hudson, Chicago Defender. I want to first say this is the closest that I've ever gotten to Anne-Marie Lipinski. She doesn't remember me. I used to be a reporter at the Tribune. And the whole time I was there, before she became the editor, I believe it's Howard Tyner, I heard about her, but I rarely saw her. So just to see her this close, I'm like, wow, I don't work there anymore. I don't work for her, but I just had to get that out. Good to see you. But my question is, with the census talks a lot, and when I say the census, individuals that I've spoken with various stories I've done, Stanley Moore is one of the persons I'm thinking about, the regional director. He said that the black community is often undercounted in the census. He puts it at something like 600,000 to 1 million. Blacks are generally not counted in the census. And one of the reasons is the big myth of, I don't want blacks have this misconception, this myth where if I put down this information, they're going to share it with other agencies, and I'm collecting unemployment, and I'm working, I have my boyfriend here, and I'm maybe getting some government assistance. So I guess my question is, what is it that you think we as reporters can do to sort of dispel a lot of these myths that are discouraging minorities from even participating?
It happens with this happens with all groups, but with African American families, they tend to not note infants, young children. In the 1980 census, I believe, now you'll have to check on these numbers, but it was about a quarter undercount on African American infants in Chicago. It was in the neighborhood of 10% or maybe a little less for white families. So it was true for everybody, but more true. So that's just one little thing about it. It got better and got a lot better in 2000. Because there was more of a focus on making sure that happens. But that's just one example of making sure you list everybody in the family on your form.
So one of the things I think that the Census Bureau has found over the years, decades, is that if a person sort of has this inherent distrust of government, the government telling them you can trust me is not a very effective message. So even if it's a census, paid advertisement in a black newspaper, it still is coming from the government. And what has been most effective is when people who are trusted in the community can communicate that message. Census Bureau has done a lot of market research, huge amount of market research, and they have found that people sort of fit in various categories. And they're, I don't remember the exact percentages, but there are sort of leaders who are decision makers and people follow. And then there's head nodders who will generally go along with the leaders. And it kind of, there's gradations up to people who are really skeptical, and there's just no way to convince them of anything. But if you have stories, for example, in your newspaper where you're talking to trusted leaders in the community, and the trusted leaders, whether they're religious from the faith community or I don't know about politicians. I guess it depends on the individual, sort of what the trust level is with the public. But I suspect in Chicago, since I read the paper a lot, maybe that's not the best place to go. But I'm sure there are other, depending on the community, depending on the locale, there are people in the community who are those leaders who kind of bring the head nodders along. And so talking to them, if they're saying, this is important, your answers are confidential, I'm going to fill out my form, and I want everybody else to fill out theirs too. This is really important. That's who people are going to listen to, and if they, if they're newspaper readers and they see that in the paper, that will have an influence.
I think for the your question was specifically about the black community, but for the immigrant community, I think it's the same sorts of myths. We're going to try to develop some resources, and I think that other nonprofits hopefully will also do the same. Based on what we're hearing from the community, we want to be able to address those questions and answer them. And even if it's just, publishing, if you work at an ethnic newspaper, publishing a quarter page of, myths, fact, a couple of them, over time, I think people will, because your publication itself is a trusted source of news for the community, I think that's an extremely important role that you can play, like sort of civically, is not just do the story, but you yourself, as the newspaper, say, I stand by this information and I want to inform you about it. We do that all the time, at least with Latino newspapers, and it tends to work pretty well in trying to inform the community about, that you heard, those two myths you heard, this is really the fact, and, so it's worked in the past for us.
Hi, I'm Lynette Kalsness. I work at Chicago Public Radio. The question that I have for you guys is, it's my understanding that the long form is going away this time around, and I'm wondering how the data that was on the long form will still be captured and how it will be released and when.
So the long form actually went away a long time ago. In its form as the long form, but it was replaced by the American Community Survey. So all of the questions that were on the long form rolled into something called the American Community Survey, and that's done on an annual basis. The long form went to about 1 in 6 people in the U.S., and so the Census Bureau and data users really agreed that, it would be nice to have that long-form data on a much more current basis than every 10 years. And the Census Bureau, in collaboration with a lot of its data user groups and researchers and others, came up with something that would provide continuous measurement of these things throughout the decade. So after the last census, the American Community Survey was launched, and that is the long form. So it's there. The data have been released. It's out there, and I really urge you to go look at it because it's just very rich. So it's going on each year. It originally was released first for large areas, and then medium-sized areas. And I forgot the exact. I think it's out now for like 20,000. Yeah, and so then after this census, there will be 5 years worth of data for very small locations, because since it's a sample and it's every year, what you have to do for really small areas is to take the 5-year, kind of a 5-year rolling average. So there will be 5 years collected in 2010, and then you can get that same richness of information for small areas, very small areas, and then it'll just keep coming out every year. So it's like you get long-form data every year.
So to follow up here, because I know 2000 there still was the long form. So I've certainly, all of us I know, have done a lot of work with community survey with ACS.
Yeah.
But does it now encompass every piece of information other than long form? Because like the homelessness statistics, for instance, and the number of jobs within all those things, are those all now captured in ACS?
I think one of these guys can probably answer that better than me, because I do a lot with the Census Bureau, but I don't actually do a lot of demographic research myself. So I think the researchers can probably tell you that.
It is the long form.
Yeah.
So it is all under. There's small changes from year to year. Been a couple of small changes in the questions over the past few years, but essentially it is the long form. But the challenge is now it is a 5-year average. So it's different than the census. The census, we know that's going to be the number on April 1st, right? This is a 5-year average, and every year it'll be a 5-year average and another 5-year average. So coming up with what's the number today in Hyde Park, you won't be able to do that. Right. You'll be able to still do the numbers, but for long-form data, you won't have a point in time where you can say this is what the case is. It'll be a 5-year average, which for a lot of purposes is inadequate, especially at the community level. Want to look at community change over time. How does it change from last year to this year? That type of things. So there's still work to be done, and this happens a lot. We do this at Chapin Hall, is to do projections year to year using other pieces, other data in order to get that. But it's harder to do with every piece of information on the long form.
Yeah, no, I got to go. But yeah, my parting shot is that this is probably this is a tough time to roll out it's a tough time to roll out 5-year estimates from the ACS, which essentially replace the long form at the census tract level, because you've got 2005, 2006, 2007. That's one economy. 2008 and 2009 are a completely different economy. So, I did a lot of work on the concentration of poverty. I mean, this is something you guys focus on too, and to say what it is, we can do it in 1990 and 2000 and sort of a snapshot. To say what that really is now, today, in Chicago or any other city is, I'm just not sure we're ever going to be able to ever put our finger on it now like we did back then.
Alan, as you're walking out, can you tell us who at Brookings? Is it you? Is it you and some others? Who, if reporters want to contact Brookings for information as they're working on their stories, who should that be?
Yeah, I mean, folks can contact me, and I have colleagues who focus on a range of different subjects that come out of the census, again, mostly with respect to big cities and metropolitan areas across the U.S., but I have a colleague, Audrey Singer, who focuses on immigration. I have a colleague, Bill Fry, who focuses on just about anything but migration and aging, and sort of household formation are some of his expertises, and I do poverty and income stuff, so... Yeah, people just call Brookings, just ask us a random question. There's got to be somebody at Brookings who knows something about this. So I encourage folks to do that.
Thank you, and safe travels. So when is why can't we answer the census questions online? What's up with that? I don't know. Someone here should know. I can answer.
So... Yeah, there's been a lot of interest in how come there's not an internet option for filling out the questionnaire. that was a decision that the Census Bureau made several years ago. The way that the census is designed, or has been designed in the past, is that they really kind of lock down the design early in the decade and then spend the rest of the decade acquiring the equipment and, figuring out the logistics of what to do. And I think at the time that decision was made, I wasn't in government at the time, but my understanding is that there was a lot of concern about internet security, hacking. Would people trust an internet option, things like that. Now, I will say that I'm very involved in 2020 planning, which has already started. And electronic response options they're definitely going to be a part of 2020. So I think it was just a decision that the Census Bureau made, sort of mid-decade that wasn't going to be viable. But as we all know, technology is changing really rapidly. So the challenge is how do you really plan and acquire what you need for something that massive, and still retain sort of the agility and the flexibility that you need to keep up with changing technologies, so that when the moment comes, when it's that year, everyone isn't saying, well, why are they 5 or 6 years behind the times? And it's because they've been planning it for 5 or 6 years and didn't change the design.
Just the idea of doing a census of everybody, trying to count everybody. And in Chicago, what's the Chicago rate for how many, do we know how many people were actually covered in Chicago? Is it 55%, 50, 60% last time? I think, something in that neighborhood. So we aren't able.
People who mail back their forms.
You mean the region?
The city for the.
I don't know about the city.
The region was 67%. I think the Chicago was below 60. I think.
Illinois was 67. Chicago was 55. Okay.
55, wasn't it? Yeah, that's what I thought.
But you're talking about people who mailed back their forms, right? Not actual. I mean, because everybody was included in the census, theoretically.
Responses. Yeah. So it's a very hard, as we've heard, it takes 10 years almost to prepare for, or longer to prepare for one. And there's really a lot of statisticians will say we should just do a sample. We can do a fine job of counting everybody using sampling. There's also the issue of using administrative data. We're all counted somewhere in some database, be it the IRS or birth certificates or food stamps or school enrollment, or we could go on. And Census Bureau does a lot of work on that. So, but again, it's a political issue as to whether or not it's done. Different parties want it done different ways and don't accept different ways. So it's a really big issue, and the cost involved in doing decennial census is huge. And many people think that money could be used better, and you could do a better job of counting people if you used other methods. But the way we do it, we've done it for such a long time. People want to continue to do that, and there are political interests in doing it this way versus other ways. That's probably the best way to say it.
Yeah, although I really do have to say that when the Census Bureau, as a statistical agency, does not consider the politics when it picks the methodology for doing the census. The Census Bureau is absolutely committed and very sincere about trying to count everyone. I mean, they don't always necessarily make the right decision, but it's not a political decision. And I want to be really clear about that. I was there during 2000. Census 2000, for example, when the big political issue was, should the Census Bureau adjust the numbers afterwards? And I can tell you unequivocally, I mean, I actually personally served on the committee that made the recommendation about whether there should be an adjustment or not. And it was absolutely not a political decision. A lot of people thought it was, but it wasn't. It was a technical decision, and I was a career person there. And so I don't think the methods are political. I think a lot of the discussion that swirls around, like where to count prisoners, those are political discussions that take place in the environment that kind of swirls around the census. But I just can't state that any strongly, that as a statistical agency, the Census Bureau does not make political decisions on their methodology for doing the census. You might take issue with the decisions that they make, but they're definitely not political.
One of the things that was talked about, Flavia, your panel talked a lot about it, which is how do you underscore the importance of the census to people who really don't want to be bothered, maybe don't even trust the government with this information. I want to draw the city into this question because I think the mayor has some opinions about why does the census matter? And so you're trying to underscore why the census matters as you're out working in the communities. And so the best answer I heard to that was, well, the census matters because for each of you who don't answer, it's $1,200 to your community potentially in federal funds that you're losing. I don't know how motivating that is if I'm concerned about my privacy, if I'm not sure that the government's handling this information in a proper way, if I can't be bothered. I have way more important things to do than to think about this. But I'm wondering, I'm sure the city has a view about why this matters, and I know it's been something of a preoccupation with your boss, as it is with other urban mayors. So I think it's important to maybe address that from both perspectives.
Thank you. I can give you an answer that's really a relaying of a story that I just heard this week. I think some people might have even been in the same meeting I was in. But a person was conveying a story that she had witnessed where, and I'm not going to be able to tell it as articulately as this person did, but basically what it came down to is that there was a social service agency that is focused on domestic violence. And it was a woman who had questions about filling out the census because they were doing some census awareness in addition to the services they provide. And the woman didn't want to fill out her form because she was afraid her husband would find out or get her information in terms of where she lives. And the agency was trying to explain to her that one of the reasons why they were able to serve her and help her was because of the dollars that come to that agency through the census. And when she understood that, she not only said that she was going to fill it out, but then she wanted to go out and volunteer to raise awareness around the census. So those are types of stories I think that are out there. Many of them are out there like that need to be told. That's how the census affects people, us, each one of us. So we're looking for assistance on PSAs and Q&A sessions on the census in the media. So anything is going to help. And there are many stories like the one I just told. I know that exist out there. So that's hoping that you will pick up on those.
So that was actually very good. That was out of Mujeres Latinas en Acción, actually one of the organizations that has a census fellow that is working in the Pilsen area. And I think that's why it is so important to have one-on-one conversations with individuals in the community that know the organizations down the street, because they have been to these organizations for a plethora of other issues that they might have had. And so there's this trust of individuals who are volunteering for this organization who say to them, we, not only is it the $400 billion that comes from the federal government, it's also that we use this money, this data, to then write our reports for foundations and philanthropy to serve communities like ours. And so it's not, like you very well stated, it's not just the $1,200. I mean, that's very much up here. When we talk about an organizing self-interest, we talk about meeting the person where they're at. So if I'm talking to, like Monica mentioned earlier, a 15-year-old boy at the door who's answered the door, right? I'm not going to be using the same kinds of messages or relaying the same kinds of informations as if a mother of 3 opens the door and clearly she's in the middle of cooking dinner, right? The conversation is much different. And I think that when we talk to individuals We talk to them about, so where do your kids go to school? And is there overcrowding in your school? And where do you take your children when they get sick? I mean, it's very real life conversations about meeting a person where they're at that very moment, so that they understand the importance way beyond this sort of esoteric, the U.S. Census is important and everyone needs to be counted, and $400 billion in federal aid. That means nothing to people, right? So that's why it's important for us to be doing the work we're doing in a very grassroots community organizing kind of way.
Sorry, I just want to make a quick comment. Another message, and this speaks to the confidentiality issue. While I do thoroughly understand the concerns that individuals have, I try to remind folks that we willingly give more information to institutions and agencies who are actually looking to take advantage of us. We give them more than we are to the census, is one thing. That's one message. And then, if I could, just real quick, the political stuff. I can't comment on the Bureau's. I always say that the Bureau and the census process is, in fact, apolitical. It becomes incredibly political when we talk about redistricting, and that's when politicians put their political hands on it and make it political. But the Bureau needs to be understood as apolitical. I think it's incredibly important.
Well, first I have a confession to make. In the 1990s, I covered the Will County Board. And Will County and Kendall County were among the fastest growing counties in the nation. And everyone was very excited, and we did a lot of stories, Plainfield and some of those other communities. Unfortunately, what was happening was a lot of people were buying homes with 100% mortgages and shaky credit, and now we're also leading in Illinois in foreclosures. And even my personal life, I know, my niece moved in with my sister-in-law, and does the high rate of foreclosures around the nation, people shifting around, more transient, is it harder to find them? More vacant homes, if it's bank-owned, yeah. So if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, the Census Bureau is very concerned about that. There are some different kinds of living arrangements that people have as a result of the downturn in the economy and the high rate of foreclosures that really can affect the responses to the census. And there's a couple of different ways that happens. So if people are, for whatever reason, experiencing homelessness, and they're using certain kinds of services. The Census Bureau has procedures to count them at soup kitchens or at shelters or things like that. They call it a service-based enumeration. But I think what actually is more worrisome isn't necessarily people who are using services, or even, in some places like in Los Angeles, and maybe this is the case in Chicago, Los Angeles has set aside specific parking lots that they patrol with security at night, where they allow people to park and sleep in their cars and RVs. I mean, they're really designated areas for people living in their cars. So, what happened? I mean, they have no mailing address. So the Census Bureau is going to send people around knocking on these parking lot doors. I mean, is somebody who's living in their car in a parking lot going to talk to an enumerator when they knock on the window and say, I'm here to enumerate you, and is this your usual place of residence? I mean, some of these people will not admit that that's their usual. Well, no, I'm here tonight, but I don't really live here, even if they've been there for 4 months already. But there is no other usual residents. That's one situation. So I think it's a really valid concern to wonder, how are people going to respond? Even if the Census Bureau gets there, finds people in their cars, knows that those are the living arrangements, will people respond? But the second one, and I think the Census Bureau found this because they do a lot of ongoing surveys all the time besides the census, as I think most of you know. Besides the American Community Survey, there's several surveys that the Census Bureau does that are household surveys where they go and knock on doors. And what they're finding with the American Community Survey and these other surveys is that families are doubled up and tripled up, and they won't admit it. They don't, someone's sister and brother-in-law moved into the basement, and so when they're asked how many people live there, they'll mention their family, but they won't mention the brother-in-law's family who's in the basement. And so the enumerators or the field interviewers on the field representatives, they call them when they do the ongoing surveys, they're pressing, they're asking, well, what about, I see other people here. Do they live here? Oh, no, they're just here temporarily for the last 12 months, and they're not leaving anytime soon. Oh, he's getting a job. He'll be out of here in no time. They don't really live here. They don't really live here, no matter how long they've been there. And so getting people to acknowledge that doubling up is very challenging. And, you just have to, you rely on the people in the house to tell you who's living there. So I think, part of the enumerator training is to probe, to ask a little bit, is that really all the people? Are there any other people who might not be immediate family members who have been living here? But yeah, that could be an issue. And if people are not willing to identify those people, they won't be counted. There's no way to count them. The Census Bureau is not going to make up the number or force, say, well, I see them here, therefore I'm putting them on your form. So encouraging people to understand, sort of what the Census Bureau calls the residency rules, usual place of residence, and that it's not something to be embarrassed about or ashamed of or something you don't tell people, that it's important to count them if that's where they are, is a big challenge.
There's a related issue, maybe a little bit the opposite way, in that when grandparents are taking care of grandchildren, they'll say, "Oh, are you this child's mother?" No, I'm not the child's mother. The mother is here, but she's just not here right now. Well, she may not. She could not be here right now. She could be homeless on the street. Who knows? In prison, where else? So there's also an issue of grandparents admitting freely that they are really the parent of this. They're taking care of this child, also for reasons of custody, and whether that the mother is to lose custody of this child if that ongoes. So there's that issue of whether or not this information will get back to government officials and whether or not that'll affect the custody of the children in a home. So there's a concern about enumerating who's really in the home, and I think both ways. They don't really live here, or they live here and they don't actually live here.
So we're out of time for this, but I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is there are a lot of subjects we didn't get to, political redistricting for one. And Jeremy and Bill is this on everyone's desk, Jeremy? Put this together, and it lists the names of some people at the university, and they can certainly connect you with others who can talk to you about that subject and lots of others, including Scott Allard, to put this conference together today. They're also, starting at 3, there are 2 different plenary sessions like this and breakout rooms, and I don't know how many folks are going to be there, but if any of you were interested in looking, the whole subject of foreclosures and housing came up. There is a plenary session on that, and another one on using the ACS and using the survey, which I know a lot of reporters already do. So you may want to stop in at one of those. I'll ask one last question, which is: any chance that Chicago becomes the second city again? Not in this census, but that online one. Yes, no.
No.
I don't have an opinion on that. I have no idea.
Doubtful.
Much better political answer. Anyway, thank you all. Jeremy and Bill will be around if you have any more questions for us in terms of the university, but we appreciate your time.